Hey friends, Pastor Paul here with our weekly Bible study update. Last week we looked at 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. And as we come into chapter 3, Paul has begun his explanation as to why he was not able to come back and visit sooner. He mentions how Satan has blocked their way. But now Paul is desperate to find out what's been going on in that church, in the assembly there in Thessalonica. So the decision is made to send Timothy, who is a great servant of the Lord and an encouragement to Paul and a companion to Paul, and they decide to send him to go and visit the Thessalonians. Now, Paul was concerned that the church was facing persecution, which makes sense given that they were already facing hardship when Paul and Silas and others were cast out from there. And Paul feels that it's likely that they are being tempted by the tempter. Think about how Satan is already at work, keeping Paul and them from visiting. Furthermore, we see that Paul's parental concern for them, one that was expressed in the last chapter, like remember the image of being orphaned, like a parent being torn away from their child, that the concern for them is reinforcing the decision to send Timothy to go and visit. But here's what happens. Timothy returns with a glowing report. The Thessalonians remembered fondly the time they had with Paul and Silas and others, and Paul has that same fondness for them. So it's a mutual admiration. It's a love for one another. Paul and his fellow believers had been facing some difficult times themselves. And as they hear this good report, they now are encouraged by what's going on by the Thessalonian believers' faith. What an incredible progression that is. They would have come in to encourage them, and now that's turned around, and these Thessalonian believers are themselves an encouragement. In fact, Paul is so encouraged and so uplifted by Timothy's report that he takes the only appropriate action. He praises God. And this praise comes in the expression of a prayer. Paul says that he's been praying day and night. And so we get insight into what this prayer may have looked like. He prays that God would clear the way for them to gather together. And this makes sense because we know that they need divine help. If Satan's blocking the way, they need divine help to open those paths. We also know in this season that even though we can stay communicating over a long distance, that is no substitute for being together in person. Paul prays that Jesus would increase their love and that their love would overflow from their love as a community, but it would overflow to everybody else, to all the other people, and that it would be reflective of the way that God had put love inside of Paul and Timothy and Silas that caused them to not only care for one another, but overflow into care that the Thessalonians were now experiencing. And finally, the prayer moves to the ongoing work of sanctification, that is, being made like Jesus, that's going on. And that they would be encouraged because it's a hard journey, even though their faith is growing, that their love is growing, that it's still a hard time they're facing persecution. So that they would stay encouraged as they await the time of Jesus to return and all the good that comes with that Jesus will set things right. So this prayer now marks a turning point in the letter. Chapter 3 comes to a close in verses 11 and 13 with this prayer. And now it's going to turn to Paul supplying some additional teaching, possibly offering a corrective or instruction of some of the challenges that they were facing that Timothy brought back in his report. And that further instruction is what we will be looking at Bible study this week. I invite you to join us. We meet every Tuesday at 7 p.m. on Zoom and hope to have you there. Blessings.